The blow off top of socialism is something that I've been talking about for quite a while. And I got that term from the guest that I'm about to sit down with today. We talked about this about a year ago in depth, and we've been watching this thesis play out over time, looking at the way that society turns basically into a Ponzi scheme to stay in power. And what are the implications of that globally as we're going through this decentralization? How does that work with the liquidity crisis or the solvency crisis that we have as sovereign nations are starting to default on their debt repayments? What does that look like with all the leverage that's been built up in the system? And how does the world get redrawn? What happens with the Bric Nations, with Russia, with China, with India, with Brazil? Where does the U.S. fit in? What happens with food and energy? How does that get redrawn? More importantly, as these nations start going bankrupt, currencies start to fail, in a time that I feel is potentially one of the most uncertain that I've ever seen in my life, my guest, Chris Macintosh from Capitalist Exploits, who runs a fund, who writes a newsletter, he feels that actually there is a lot of certainty. When I feel it's more uncertain, he feels there's certainty, and he is going to explain all this, break it all down for you. And at the end, if you stay to the end, don't leave, he gives you the areas that he's looking to put his money, even the percentages of breakdowns into the categories that he thinks is right today. So if you want to keep your money, if you want to build, grow, and protect your wealth, if you want to increase your purchasing power in a time where the world is changing and seems more uncertain than ever before, then you do not want to miss this interview with Chris Macintosh. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So, Chris, let's try this again. We just tried to start a record on one platform. It didn't work, and we're jumping over to Zoom. So I was framing it up saying that last time you and I had talked, we had spent a couple hours talking, didn't record it. And I've been kind of using your term called the blow off top of socialism. And I don't know if I'm using it the right way. So, and I know it's something that you've continued to work on and you're writing about. So you were about to explain to us what this blow off top of socialism is. So let's go ahead and dig into that part.
Sure. So if we're going to quickly take a step back to the sort of post-World War II environment, what we had was industrialization. So much of the Western liberal democracies, if you will, followed a path of industrializing. And increasingly that two things happened. As the wealth generated from that process flowed through, more and more of that wealth was commandeered by government institutions to the extent where things ended up getting more and more outsourced to the government. So if we think about education, health, transportation, transfer payments of all various descriptions, pensions, you name it, all of that has been sort of transferred into government hands to the extent now where people not only expect it, but they think it's a good idea because it's been around for so long. It's just it's treated like a utility.
A good idea for the government to pick up more of the slack and provide more services.
Yeah, and frighteningly, people think, like I said, think it's a good idea with a zero understanding of how it's all financed. And of course, the financing of that was originally done via taxation from the productive, industrializing portion, if you will, of the economy. When that started failing, credit was brought in. Well, credit was brought in before for actual credit purposes within corporate activity, but it increasingly became a situation where it basically got financialized. And so we've got the situation now, which is actually should have blown up in 2008, whereby the governments themselves have taken on far more obligations and liabilities than they can muster. That's mathematically provable, and everybody, at least within our world, understands that. So that's kind of the structure of that system, which can't go on because it's mathematically impossible for it to do so. But we talk about sort of blow off top in socialism. It's in order to stay relevant or in control from a political side of things, the only way that you can continue to do that without, at least in a democratic environment, is to promise more things. because you've got a populace that is largely bred on the idea that things are free. You see, oh, this is free and that's free. It's like, there's nothing free. We know that. Somebody always pays the cost of that. But the vast, voting populace don't understand that. And so in order to stay in power, you either have to keep what's in existence, pensions and all these various obligations, and or offer more. And the only way to actually balance that budget, well, you can't balance it, but the only way to actually keep providing those services is with more debt. So that's just this structural, mathematical blow off top. And so you're thinking about any blow off top in the market, whether a dot-com era, housing bubble, whatever it is, you kind of have these last phases where it gets really, really silly. So we've seen that now in the last couple of years with the COVID thing, a massive blow off in monetary issuance and debt. And so that's failing. It's going to fail. Those that are in power, I think, realize that, and they have plans to wipe out that debt and retain control, because it's about control. It's not about financial stable, being financially stable. It's about control. So what you and I spoke about more recently, the second time we were chatting, was about how I think things will transpire going forward, because things don't happen in a vacuum. So, this Western economic system, which I would call a deindustrializing system, doesn't operate on its own, right? It operates within a world where there are other nations doing other things. And so that's kind of what I've been working on lately, is trying to figure out how that is likely to move forward. But the blow off top in socialism, I think, is evident. It's a matter of issuing more credit. That's now coming home to roost with respect to inflation, as well as just a breakdown of society, because there is an inability to actually sustain something which is unsustainable. But instead, it's like when something's gotten that bad, I kind of liken it, Mark, to a gambler who's gone into Vegas with, let's say, $100,000.
Yeah.
They've been betting along, maybe they won a bit and lost a bit, and eventually they get to the point where they're down to 50. They're like, oh, shit, well, I need to pull out a bit of a whop here to kind of get back, but it's doable, right? It's doable.
Yeah.
And then you're down to 10. You're like, okay, I need a 10x. And then you're at zero, but there's a bloody loan shop just outside the casino, and you saw it on the way in. And you're like, I don't want to go home to the wife empty-handed because it's the mortgage payment. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to lose the house anyway, but I could go and borrow some money, and then I might get it back, and I might get back to break even. I might even make some money. And so that's basically where governments are at today. And they don't have the intestinal fortitude to actually do the right thing, so they won't. And at the end of the day, there's very little personal risk to them to doing so, because there's no skin in the game. So they don't pay the price of the actions taken, and hence the actions that are being taken are detrimental to everyone. There is an inability to pay back that debt, and even an unwillingness, I guess. So that's where we are at today, largely.
Oh, a lot to unpack there, and I'm excited to dig into this as we can think about how, as you said, how things transpire, how things move forward. So I want to get into that, this deindustrialization, as I've been talking about this decentralization. But let's take a couple steps back. So if we start with the blow off top of socialism, you talked about how this industrialization has built these big governments. Governments have co-opted things. Tell me how you think about democracy, and in the way that I've kind of come to start looking at this is like democracy is like a little bit of a better version of communism. So under communism, things are so strict, and of course, everything is co-opted by the state, that there's no real wealth created. Whereas democracy is sort of like this semi quasi sort of free system, but it's really a tyranny of the minority by the majority. And it allows wealth to grow faster, which just allows the state to co-opt more and actually get much bigger and much larger and much more powerful than they could under a communist system, which has allowed it to grow bigger. And maybe this whole problem has gotten even bigger than it might have been under a communist system that never achieved this level of wealth. What do you think about that?
Well, we could talk about this for hours, Mark. I mean, you've laid it out well. So I think the way that I've recently been thinking about it is in terms of generations. Okay, so as a basic structure, democracy compared to other forms of autocratic rule, communism, whatever, allows for the most freedom. Any system which allows for the most freedom harnesses human capabilities better than alternatives. And we can call them whatever you wish. If we took, for example, a place like Singapore, which is an authoritarian, it's a dictatorship. What they actually allowed up until more recently was very much freedom of economic expression. Not political expression, but a lot of freedom of economic expression. And the results were phenomenal. So you could take that, and then you could take their neighbor, Malaysia, which at least ostensibly is a democracy, and it's faltered comparatively. So it's not necessarily about a political structure, but more about one of freedoms within that structure, whatever you call it. Where you have a lot of freedoms for individuals, you have an ability for productivity, better living standards, and everything else. So I think it's kind of important to differentiate, because it's easy to label things and go, oh, that's a democracy and that's not that's a communist setup or whatever it is, and then make judgment calls around that, which can be incorrect or at least somewhat misleading. Yeah. So, that's kind of, and then when you think about generations, you can have as we've had, a democratic setup, but within that democratic setup, where you brought in these social niceties, if you will, public transportation, free healthcare, free schooling, all these sorts of things, they become guaranteed or deemed to be guaranteed. And
in the United States, they go as far as to call them rights. They have a right to healthcare, supposedly.
Exactly, but people forget that for every right that exists, there's someone else's responsibility, and it's like, well, whose responsibility is it? And then, of course, it's like, oh, it's free. Well, nothing's free. So there's a responsibility, and there's a compensation that has to take place in order for that to exist. And then you come to rent extraction, right? Yeah. And so you got a cohort of society. You go, well, why am I paying for a service I'm not using? If you don't have children, you're like, why should I be paying for a free education? Now you can make the argument and say, well, you want to have a society that's educated and better citizens and everything else, and I don't discount that. But the point behind it is you can keep layering on these things, whether it be education, whether it be transportation, whether it be healthcare. We could get really deep in the weeds. You could say, well, if you're a fat bugger and you eat donuts every day and you have a heart attack, why should I pay for you to have continued medical treatments when you haven't looked after yourself? And here I am, and I don't do that, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of those, and again, that comes back to this constant yin and yang that we have in society throughout ages of what's good for society, what's good for the individual. As a libertarian, I believe that if it's good for the individual as a whole, it's good for society.
Well, under that view, there is no such thing as society. There's only the individual. Exactly. And so collectively, as the individual, we Yeah, right. So it's there's only the individual. There's no society. There's no community. There's no government. Whatever. No people. This is the individual. And to your point, different individuals will align based off of whatever interest pull them together. But going back to what you're talking about, it sounds like you're talking about a Ponzi scheme
Of
where
course.
um, where I have to continue to give away more and more resources to gain more and more votes, and then I have to continue to pay out all of those resources to keep those votes. But I also, to your point, have to keep increasing them, because if I want to beat you in the next election cycle, I have to promise more than what you're promising, or I have to promise more than what I promised last time. And so then it's like this Ponzi scheme where it's always more and more and more, and you're paying out those promises from a smaller, and this is the problem that we're running into. I guess the last 100 years worked out okay because we had growing debt and we had growing populations. And now we're going into a debt deleveraging cycle and a depopulation cycle. And then the Ponzi scheme works opposite almost.
It's funny, the more, and I never used to think this, the more I think about it over the last few years, I've come to the conclusion that there isn't a perfect model that will work in perpetuity because of human nature. So here's a good example. You go back, where the Mafia came from in Sicily. Right. Originally, what was happening, you had the Northerners were coming down and stealing from farmers in the south of Italy. And they kept coming out, taking grain and everything else. And they got all pissed off and they're like, well, we don't want to keep basically paying these rents, if you will, and this theft. So what they did was farmers started retaliating. They started fighting back when they came down to take stores of grain and so on and so forth. And so then in order to do that as an individual, you just get wiped out, right? It's like having a mob arriving at your farm. You can't do anything. You're one guy and there's 10 of them. So what they did was, as a collective, they got together and they said, we're going to stop these bastards. They're coming down. We're going to stop them as a collective. Now, that then became something that they needed to consistently do in order to repel this force. And as such, they couldn't spend the same amount of time farming, right? There's a certain portion, maybe 10%, 20%, whatever it was, that needed to be dedicated to protection of their assets. And so they did that. They said, okay, well, we'll collectively come across the community and we will take some of these resources and we will contribute to these men who will protect us. They were the Mafia. And then the Mafia originally was a fantastic idea, okay? It was a collective community that came together to protect their own interests. Now, they did that. And then when they sufficiently repelled their enemies, they were now fully employed to protect their enemies, but there wasn't a threat anymore. So what did they do? They became their own threat. They literally, as time progressed, they would be the guys who would come in and say, well, you need to pay us for us to protect you. It was protection money. And people were going, well, there's nothing to protect from. And then they'd bring out a baseball bat and they'd be like, yeah, there is. and so you had this, this collective group of people who became the Mafia, and it flipped. So you created a structure that was detrimental in the long term. In the short term, it provided a service that was required by individuals. And that's just, I guess, a little story in terms of how human nature and human psychology works. And much in the same light, coming out of World War II, you had to rebuild these institutions. You wanted to have an educated populace. You wanted to have lower poverty levels. So as humans, we have empathy. We look at people who don't have something and we don't really want to live in that environment. You and I have been to many countries in the world where, fortunately for us, we can live with relative wealth, but we're still driving through streets where there's poverty and it's not nice. It's not attractive. We don't like it. And so you want to have a society that, I'd much rather live in a society where there's relatively wealth all around, and I'm not a billionaire or anything else like that, but I live in an environment that's actually safe and secure and peaceful and everything else. So there's a natural sort of tendency to want these things. And then you go, how do you go about doing that? And that's where we get into the situation of, oh, well, you can take the state, someone has to give, so how do we do that? Oh, well, we'll just give 10% of our money so that we can have this nice environment. Sounds like a reasonable thing. If you and I were neighbors and we had 5 other properties around us, and there's something as simple as having the lawns done, it's like an HOA. We go, oh, well, we want to have a nice environment. I'm too busy. Can you do the lawns, Mark? No, I'm busy. I'm like, oh, fuck it. Okay, let's find some dude. We'll pay him to do the lawns. Pay him, I don't know, $100 a week and just does the lawn. So then there's a collective payment. And then someone comes in and goes, well, I don't want to pay $100. I'll have my lawn my own way. And, and that, so you have these sort of conflicts. So this is just, I think, a part of how societies move through cycles. And the point I guess I want to make is that we're at the stage now where we've collectively gone way too far. And that what should have been a community aspect to help elevate society has just become a rent extraction tool by sociopaths, right, who are there purely for control and power and don't care at all about whether you want your lawn mowed.
Yeah. Frederick Bastiat wrote the book, The Law, which is just a booklet. Everybody should read it. And he labels the term legal plunder. So the law, people will use the law to extract wealth, to your point, legally plunder from people, right? And that's kind of, I think, what you're talking about. So, and then I think about unintended consequences. And then I think about, you mentioned the word skin in the game, or I would think about incentives, right? And so when you have incentives that are misaligned, then you get all these unintended consequences. And this is kind of where you end up on. I'd love to sit there and talk about the political side of things, but I'm more interested to think about it in terms of where we are today, and maybe, like as you said, like how will things transpire moving forward? Because, man, it's more uncertain today than I feel like it's ever been in my lifetime, and I'm really interested to get your opinion on where you think things are going, because I can't seem to make heads from tails here. And so you mentioned before, like, maybe back in 2008 is where things really crashed. So we could say for 100 years, things have continued to get this blow off top of socialism. So sucking more people in, the government's gotten bigger, the rent seekers have gotten bigger. We've assigned more and more to the government. In the United States, when FDR took over, that was a big deal. But today that makes that look like nothing, right? And so we can see how for 100 years or so, we've been really going to this kind of a parabolic run up to this blow off top. 2008 kind of crashed, but then somehow they saved the system, so to speak, right? We started QE. Although if you look at the markets minus the monetary expansion, they don't really look like they've recovered. And here we are in another situation where it's like, man, I don't think they can save it this time. But I don't know. Can they? I mean, is that what you're looking at? Should we go there, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, look, the economy's been on life support since 2008. That's just the reality. And the solution that they came up with essentially was credit. People talk about liquidity, and they've confused liquidity with solvency, right? So liquidity and solvency are not the same thing, but they provided extraordinary liquidity, which masks solvency or lack of solvency.
So how would you define the difference of those two?
Well, solvency is an actual ability to pay your debts. Liquidity is immediate payment of debt. So you could be solvent. You can be solvent, but you don't have sufficient liquidity. Let's just say, for argument's sake, the property that you're in now, let's just say it's $1 million property, and you have $100,000 owing on it. Okay. Purely on a balance sheet terms, you're fine. Doesn't matter. But if I demand immediate payment from you within a week, you're illiquid. Assuming you have no other cash sitting around or anything else like that. If we just take that asset and it doesn't, maybe it produces cash flows of, I don't know, $1,000 a month, just for ease of numbers.
Right.
Well, you can't, you're illiquid, but you're not insolvent. Okay. Now, the issue with governments is they're insolvent, but they're liquid. They provide the liquidity in the banking system, and they can keep providing liquidity, which masks insolvency. The situation that we've come to today, largely in the Western world, is that the liquidity is insufficient to catch up with the looming insolvency, with the fact that it is insolvent. And so, and the only way to quote unquote solve that problem is to provide more liquidity. But now you're providing more liquidity on the back of a drop in production, right? They shut down the world for 2 years, roughly, or at least they cocked up supply chains, and they shut down various components of society and so on and so forth, which is collapsed productivity at the same time that they're trying to bring this additional liquidity into the system to mask their insolvency, hence massive inflation.
So like, actually, maybe we take that back to your story of the gambler. So he is insolvent. He has no more money in his bank to continue gambling on. But then he has the guy outside, as you said, that would loan him money. So they offer him liquidity, even though he's insolvent, to pay that liquidity back. Right.
Pretty much. Yep.
Yeah. So we've been in this this period of expanding liquidity through these this last dozen or so years of quantitative easing and declining productivity at the same time. And now it's been accelerated both by, to your point, the whole world shutting down through COVID, forced to shut down. And then also now through this deglobalization that's really been brought on by the globalists, but also with Russia, Ukraine. And then on top of that, all the world leaders seem pretty hell-bent on nationalizing these industries to even slow productivity down even more, nationalizing the food, the energy, things like that. Are you seeing the same thing there?
I am. I think it's simply an extrapolation of what we've just discussed. So if you think about the gambler and your credit lines that he's been getting, that interaction there makes some sense, provided the guy outside, the loan shark, can somehow recoup his capital. Okay. But that the gambler's got no money. He doesn't have any collateral, right? Hence he's insolvent. So where is it? So the gambler's the problem. Sorry, not the gambler. The loan shark is the problem. How does that get solved? On a geopolitical macro scale, that loan shark is largely Western governments and central banks. Because over the last 40 years, at an accelerating pace now, what's been happening is that as the Western world, which was industrializing, basically began deindustrializing and manufacturing shift to Eurasia, China, India, other Asian countries, the global south to some extent, but mostly to Asia. The trade there was to acquire US dollars, right? And those US dollars that those countries could acquire, they would just keep recycling them back into treasuries. And it worked insofar as they could elevate themselves out of poverty and build a large middle class. So basically, as long as the game kept going, it made some sense for them to continue to do so. While that was taking place in I'll call it the Western financialized system, the way for them to continue to do this was just to keep financializing assets, right? To create something that those dollar reserves could come back and buy. And unfortunately, what it's done is it created bubbles in things that didn't really necessarily make sense, and it doesn't create any real productivity in at least in the Western world. So it masks a lot of these problems. And the situation that we've kind of got today now is there's a conflict between your deindustrializing economies of the West, the EU, North America, call it NATO, and then your manufacturing, industrializing socialist countries of China, India, Russia, the global south. And so that conflict being, what was a financial conflict is now becoming a hot war. Part of that is the Ukraine conflict. And really where I think this heads to, we're talking about, okay, well, what does this mean for going forward? Well, the West has got this very high cost economy because of the socialism. That's why I talk about a blow off top in socialism. They've brought a lot of liabilities that are high cost. On the other hand, your industrializing sort of socialist economies on a relative basis don't have as high a cost to manage, right? Because you just don't have the liabilities in the same line.
Give me some examples on the different countries. So obviously, like the United States with the big entitlements, specifically like Medicare, I think something crazy like 95% of your life's health costs come in like the last 90 days of your life or something like that. So we could see massive costs in the West, whereas maybe a socialist nation like North Korea or something, I don't know, has very low cost.
China's a pretty good example, or you could even take India.
Okay.
And then, by the way, so there's two different structures there. So India is a large democracy, and China's is an authoritarian dictatorship, if you will. But economically, have a similar structure. So there's relative freedoms within the business world. In fact, you could argue that China's got more relative freedoms in the business world than India does, only insofar as India's got much more red tape at a bureaucratic level for businesses to operate. But nevertheless, both of those economic structures have less liabilities to their own citizens. They might have other external liabilities, dollar loans and things of that nature, but as an economic structure, they don't have the same high cost economy that the West basically has. And so, the West is debt financing those things. These other countries don't have to debt finance them. Even if they did, they have typically trade surpluses where they can actually manage that. But the fact is they don't have them. So it's like the liability doesn't even exist. And that's important because what it means is at a society level, society doesn't expect it, right? As soon as you give something to someone, the longer you give it to them, the more they expect it, to the point where, as you accurately mentioned, it becomes a right.
Yep.
That's a very, very dangerous setup, because to try to then take that away from someone is just social upheaval, right?
Yeah. I think everyone's probably had that example where they've, helped a friend or a family member for a period of time and then gone out of your way. And then when you stop that help, all of a sudden you're the bad guy. I had a guy that worked for me a long time ago, and he had some family problems. I think his wife got like hooked on drugs, and he would wake up in the morning and she would just be gone. And he couldn't come into work. And I felt really bad for him. He had like a young kid. And so I was like letting him make up hours. And next thing you know, it was getting worse. It was coming in the middle of the night to like make up hours. And finally I said, look, Dave, like, this doesn't work for me. I need you here during like normal working hours, And he looked at me from across my desk and he said, it's your fault. You've enabled me to get to this point. And I was like, what? But that's exactly the point. Like, we've enabled all these people to get to this point where they've expected all of these things. And they don't look at it as a good thing. It's like, once you take that punch bowl away, they're ready to bring the pitchforks out.
Yeah. And what it does is, as like further to your point, it affects your business.
Yeah.
Right? So you think about like, the West, you've got this high cost economy. You've got housing, education, medical expenses. All of this stuff is debt financed. And that really means that you leave less and less personal and business income to be invested into actual productivity, capital formation. And so the whole system starts constricting that which is good, productivity, production, at the expense of this debt financed system, because that doesn't actually make it. It's like people go, oh, the government does this. The government doesn't make anything, right? They're just an extraction tool from one source of the economy to another.
Yep.
And so that's where we have this blow off top in this Western-led socialist system. But, and this is the important part, they don't want to let go of that authority and that power that they've managed to secure. And they're securing more and more of it as it constricts. You know, there's like there's an interesting thing that took place in South Africa a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember the riots that were taking place down there, but and it was just this thing that stuck out in my head. There was a young guy who was being interviewed on the streets. He was like a thug, or he was looting a supermarket, and this guy stopped him and he was like, "What are you doing?" And he interviewed him with his phone, and he was like, "Well, I didn't want to do it." He says, "But when I saw that they were emptying the supermarket, I realized that if I didn't go now, I would have nothing." And that's largely governments today. They're seeing the economy shrinking. They're seeing the pool of things that produce for them. They're seeing it go away. So they're extracting more of it. They're grabbing it while they can. That in itself accelerates the decline of that very system.
Right.
So but the alternative, because we talk about China and India and stuff like this, these are the kind of two systems I think that are in conflict. You have this production, industrialized oriented economic structure, and we could call it, people would sort of understand the BRICS. We could call it the BRICS. There's the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is kind of replacing that. And basically you have an alliance of these countries which are on a different economic structure and on a different timeline to the West. They have all sorts of problems, don't get me wrong. One of which is a lot of dollar debt, because they trade the goods and services that they buy and sell have been in dollars, and that's a problem. And I think we're going to have a whole host of emerging market sovereign defaults, certainly in the global south, over the next 12 to 18, maybe 24 months. But while that's taking place, we have this huge issue, which everyone listening to this would know about, with food and energy. So if you go and you think about that Western-led system, how have they managed to control a lot of countries? Well, they've done it via this financialization, credit. So you have the IMF step in, they will lend $2 billion, $4 billion, whatever it is, to some country in, I don't know, Nigeria, Luanda, whatever it is. And it comes contingent with a whole lot of things. So they have to follow certain measures and so on and so forth. And that's how they keep them under control. And it's not actually about helping them out. It's about keeping them under control. And that's basically been the trade. That entire structure is one of credit. That's the IMF, which is a rent extraction tool from all these other countries that is then controlling a lot of these other peripheral nations. Now, the flip side of that is that while this has been going on for 40 odd years at an accelerating pace, China's been playing much of the same game. They've been building infrastructure in many of these countries where they realize that they need some of the resources that those countries have, whether it be iron ore or grains or whatever. So they'll go in and they'll build infrastructure for them, and they'll indebt them. And they don't want the debt paid back, just like the IMF don't want the debt paid back. But now there's a trade, right? Because a lot of, certainly if you look at Africa, Africa's a net importer of food, one of the worst. So they'll be the first to be hit with food shortages. And so what I have been thinking about when you and I sort of last had a chat about it was, what I think is going to happen as a geopolitical tool is the industrializing, call it BRICS loosely, nations are going to utilize energy and food as a geopolitical tool. They will go and they will trade with these countries, and although that trade is going to be contingent on other things. Right. So, for example, the IMF might lend money to Ghana and say, okay, yeah, we're going to give you $2 billion and you can feed yourself. But all you're getting is paper. You're not getting the food. You're still got to buy the food. Okay. Contingent on that would probably be, don't trade with Russia. who produce the goddamn food.
Right.
Russia can come and do the same thing and say, we'll give you food. We don't need to give you credit. We don't have credit to give you. We can give you food.
Which is what people need and want.
Which is what people need and want. And that will be contingent. And it'll be contingent on not taking IMF loans, for example, or whatever. I don't know. But the point is, this is an economic weapon that's going to be used to influence and control the global south in particular, and many other periphery countries. So that's kind of where we're sitting today. We'll see that, I think, taking place in Latin America, in South America. Argentina just asked to join the BRICS. They've been doing deals with China, just writing about it now. So Putin's just coming back from where was it? He went to, I'm trying to think now, some African country, Senegal. He went to Senegal. And guess what he was offering President Mackie over there?
Food and energy?
Grain.
Yeah.
Grain. Because they're a net importer of food. And you can bet your ass that that's contingent on certain things. It's not going to be just a freebie, we'll give you grain, or, it's going to be contingent on a number of things. And one of those things will almost certainly be that he will want to bring them into his sphere of influence, right? So they won't be doing deals with the IMF or the World Bank or anything of that nature. So that's kind of this world that we're in now, where you have this financialized, debt-based credit system in the West that is competing now with an industrialized or industrializing, production-based socialist system. I say socialist because China's kind of still socialist, India's still sort of socialist. For example, in that respect, they're moving to where the West was 20, 30 years ago, where they will provide roading, highways, transportation as government services. You pay for them, but they're built by and managed and run by the government.
So this is something that, a lot of people are seeing. I've been talking about money isn't wealth. Money helps us acquire wealth. What we need is energy and food, right? We can't live without it. And we're kind of in the situation now, I think, to your point, is that we've created all this debt, all this liquidity, but there's no wealth there. The liquidity is great, but what we really need is food. We need grain or we need energy. And so to Senegal, they could say, well, shoot, we could take the 2 billion from the IMF, but then how do I get grain? Thanks for the money, but I need the grain. Who can give me the grain? Or Russia can say, we'll give you the grain, but not the money. But they don't need the money. The money only helps them acquire the grain, right? And where the IMF, World Bank, Fed, et cetera, ECB, et cetera, have found themselves is that they can't print more food and energy. And so then we get to a situation where really it's the nations that are producing the commodities that will end up having the upper hand.
Mark, we're watching this happening now in the energy markets. Okay. So think about the EU are sanctioned, any EU country are sanctioned from buying Russian crude oil. Yeah. And I remember when these first came out, I wrote about it saying, well, Russian crude oil is still going to go to Europe. We're just going to have middlemen. That's all that's going to happen. It's what happens every time. So it's just now a question of who's the middleman, and those middlemen are going to cream it. They're going to make a ton of money. So if you look at what's actually happening now, you've got India's buying Russian oil, then they're literally exporting it to Europe. China's buying Russian crude, they're refining it, and then they're turning it into refined products, selling it to Europe. China and Saudi have got a deal where, Saudi and Russia, where it's basically a swap, right? Because so Saudi Arabia is not sanctioned, okay? So they got a bunch of oil, sitting in a box here, and then they're fueling their own services, power stations and everything else with their own crude oil, as you would. Now all they're doing is they're buying Russian oil at a discount, and they can literally go and put it into their bucket over here. And then the stuff that they would have used in this bucket here, which is theirs, they just export it to Europe. So it's just a swap, and they're profiting because they're getting the Russian oil at a discount. Okay, the net setup here is that Europe gets fucked no matter what. They are the net. They're the worst. That is the political football within this whole structure. They're going to pay. They're going to still take Russian oil. They're just going to pay a premium for it. And Russia,
Well, as of today, Germany announced that they're going to stop taking the gas, Russian gas, and they're going to go back to coal.
Oh God. We wrote about this a couple of months ago, and we said the biggest beneficiary out of all of this is going to be coal, because both the natural gas, right, because it's an easy substitute into electrical power grids, natural gas to coal. And we didn't anticipate that Europe would actually be so stubborn, frankly.
Yeah. Thought they would cave in sooner.
Well, not just that. Look, Germany, for example, had, I think it was 11 nuclear power stations.
17.
Way back, yeah. And so now, like, turn them back on. I mean, I know it's not like that simple, but they have 3 left. That's where they need to go.
3 left that are still scheduled for being shut down.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I thought that there'd be more rational thought behind this, that they would actually say, okay, fine, if we're not going to take Russian oil and gas, let's wean ourselves off of it, right? Instead of just cutting it off. Let's wean ourselves off. Let's go back to nuclear, which is by far much better than, in fact, they're not even doing coal, they're doing lignite, which is like fucking horrendous stuff. So doing coal and lignite, and the same is going to be true across much of Europe. So coal will come back as and the justification that they will have for it is that it's an emergency and it's a national security interest.
Which it is. So. It is an emergency and it is a national security.
Of course it is. I've been saying this is kind of almost like my mantra, is that you don't have any political security if you don't have energy security.
Right.
And so here we are. But again, within that structure, you've got their ability to actually bring all this stuff in. This is all credit-based. It's financialized. It's credit-based. So we have, I just think Europe is in a real predicament. They're a political football between the United States and Russia now. Ukraine is just a political football in there.
What about the Middle East and even the South, as you call them? I mean, they're the ones that potentially could see 1 billion people starve to death. I mean, they're a political football.
Yeah. I mean, look, the issue with the Middle East has been...
I'm just saying, whoever gets the grain, whoever's the net recipient of all the food that comes from the breadbasket of Ukraine and Russia, I mean, they're going to be severely impacted. They're also kind of a football.
True. I mean, the thing that the Middle East has is it has energy, and they've always traded energy for food. That's not, it's never been an issue. It only becomes an issue when energy prices fall sufficiently. And or when those governments, which is kind of socialist in that respect, because they basically pay off their populace, when they run big deficits and then they don't have sufficient cash available to actually buy the food. But that's not the situation today in most of those countries. The situation today is that they're printing money. What they have is in dire need and in short supply. So I'm less concerned with the Middle East starving as I am with Africa starving.
And I guess would you consider Egypt part of Africa?
Yeah. I mean, Egypt's got some huge problems. They also run massive deficits. And so that they're likely to have a balance of payments crisis, as are probably Pakistan Is we're going to have, if I'm right, we're going to have a wave of sovereign defaults in the next year or two.
Yeah.
Kind of
What does that? What does that look like? What does that look
it
like?
looks like Sri Lanka. Kind of looks like Sri Lanka.
What does that look like to people in the West, though?
It won't affect people in the West particularly much. It what it probably could mean is a run into the dollar, because it then becomes both a solvency and a liquidity issue for emerging markets. And so we could have like sort of an Asian crisis redux of some nature.
So where all these sovereign debts blow up, their currencies dissolve, and they just go to the dollar.
Yeah, well, it's because it's a matter of we have one default, and there's a rush to try and stave off that default. That's a dollar demand, right? That in itself can bring more upward pressure on the dollar, while at the same time the Fed's hiking, right? So you have an interest rate arbitrage, and you have a rising dollar. I mean, it's like if I could give you an investment, Mark, and I said the probability of this going up in terms of equity revaluation is high, and you're increasingly being paid more on the dividend, i.e. interest coupon, would you want to own it? You'd be like, sounds pretty good to me. So that's kind of what the dollar starts looking like. And then that, of course, can, as more capital comes in, as a consequence of emerging market dollar repayments and collapse in their own currency, that fuels the dollar, which then can cause a knock-on effect, just like we had in an Asian crisis. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but the probability of that happening is much higher today than it has been since 1997, which is when we had that last sort of kickoff. So I think it's highly probable we'll have emerging market sovereign defaults. But again, this is all while there's food shortages, energy shortages, all these other things transpiring. And that's where I think we're going to start seeing fairly significant geopolitical players coming in. From if you and I were Xi Jinping and we're sitting there watching a country which we want their resources and we see them defaulting, they're going to have a sovereign debt crisis. We go, okay, what do they need? Do they need energy and food? Well, yeah. Can we provide it to them? Can we come in and save the day?
But they can't, right? I mean, China imports 85% of their energy. What energy do they have to provide? They import, I think, 65% of their food inputs. What can they provide on food or energy?
They can provide a lot of.
They can buy it from Iraq and then sell it to.
Whoever? Not necessarily. They can, in terms. This comes back to what I was mentioning before. If you look over the last 20 years, but up to the last 10 years at an accelerating pace, the infrastructure built in much of Africa has been Chinese financed, Chinese loans.
Right.
And so, those assets that they effectively own, they can go in and they can say, well, look, we can help you on this. Let's help you. Right.
But don't they have the same
interest-free loans? Basically,
right, isn't that the same problem as the IMF, where they can give more loans, they can provide more liquidity, to your point, but what the country really needs is food and energy, and they can't provide the food. They can give the loan, so the IMF can also give the loan. What they really need is the food and energy. So China can't help with the food and energy unless they could get someone else to take their liquidity, and they can give that.
Yeah, so this is where, if you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, it's a quasi BRICS, and it's also very closely tied into the Belt and Road Initiative. Mm-hmm. There's strong alliances that are being built there. And what they were trying to do is bring more control and more power into that organization. So again, if you take some African country that's the food and energy, within that organization, within that alliance, there is an ability to help them. So China can do it in terms of the credit that is owed to China because of all the infrastructure they built, highways and pipelines and railroads and airports and all this kind of garbage. They can help them with that. right? They can sell out, interest-free loans for the next 5 years, whatever it is. And they will do that sort of stuff. They'll do it at a price. Within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there, you've got other countries like Russia, a lot of the stands who are net exporters of food, that can and will help. And so China will help finance and do deals with, say, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. I've got a mate who's in Uzbekistan, and we're talking about they're a net exporter of food, so they can easily feed themselves as well as other parts. So, and there are incentives for them to be basically taking Chinese loans on other things, and so I can see a lot of that sort of forming. Again, to the point, I just mentioned Senegal and Putin going and visiting them and offering them grain. That kind of stuff will take place, I think, at an accelerating pace, as well as bringing in like Brazil, Argentina into the fold. And basically, because it's trade, if you think about it, it's trade, right? What can those countries that are defaulting, what can they provide to any of these organizations there? Or not organizations, these countries that they don't have.
And you don't think the US and the US and IMF would be willing to do that or unable to do that?
Oh, they're doing it. That's what the US
is opening swap lines with these countries.
Yep. I don't think that goes away. All I'm saying is that there is an alternative now that's being presented. That's the difference.
Now they go, should we align with the IMF and the EU, USA, or should we align with the BRICS nations or whatever, the Eurasian, whatever?
Yeah, simplistically, that's pretty much it. Yeah, and so that's really important in terms of where things land up heading for the next 40, 50 years, I think. We're at a point in time, if you go back over historical periods, this is it. Every 100 odd years, the world gets reshaped. You think about coming out of World War II. You had countries that literally decided, okay, we're going with the USSR. And part of it was a decision. They could have very strongly aligned themselves with the Allies and gone a different way, and they didn't. And others, so like in hindsight, we look and go, wow, that was a pretty fucked up decision.
Yeah.
But so, and this is kind of where we're at today. I don't know for sure what's the best decision. It's, in many respects, a lot of it is kind of two very difficult decisions. And neither of them necessarily look great. But again, it comes back to what we mentioned before. The system that has the most personal and economic freedom will likely outperform the other.
So it sounds like you think that this debt-based system still has some legs underneath it. Like we're not seeing the complete collapse of this debt-based system, which China, the US, the West all run on. Instead of going more to a commodity-based system, like maybe Zoltan Pozar has been kind of throwing out, which you're talking about, these nations, they don't need the $2 billion from the IMF. They need the food and energy, but these nations could provide liquidity to another nation who has the food and energy and give it to this other nation. So is your thesis that you think this debt-based system that we have isn't about to implode and it still has legs for the next 2 to 5 years?
I've given up trying to figure out what the timing on it is, Mark. No, I mean, look, you and I had a conversation like 5 years ago and gone, look, here's what we know.
I've been waiting for it to blow up since 2008,
Exactly. And they managed to pull it together and we all were quite surprised.
Yeah.
Can they pull it together again? I don't think so, but I don't think it matters. When I think about how we manage capital, we look and we say, okay, what's probability look like? And then what's it like on a time, like our time frame is sort of 5 years plus. So I go on a 5 year plus time frame, what is the probability? The probability is no, they can't hold this together. Pensions already broke. They can keep printing money, but that's increasingly accelerating inflation.
Right.
And so the social collapse that comes with that, I think, will then also, because that anytime you get like social unrest and social collapse, productivity just collapses,
right
within a society. So you have, and then how are they going to solve that productivity collapse? They've only got one tool: just print more money, issue more credit,
right
or one of the other things they try to do is, oh, that's demand. Let's lock people down. If we could just lock people down more, if they could just stop them from moving, stop them,
which is where they're at now. It seems like demand destruction.
Which is where they're at now. They're trying as best as they can to get demand destruction. But the problem with doing that is twofold. One, you cause people to starve, literally. And two, if your supply destruction is taking place more rapidly than your demand destruction, prices still go up.
Right.
And so we've had CapEx spending in the energy space in particular is at all-time lows. Ordinarily, in this commodity cycle we're in, we should have seen CapEx spending rising 2 years ago. And it's not. It's not, because there's such an extraordinary political narrative around climate Nazis and all this sort of nonsense that has caused, basically your Western financial institutions are far too busy being woke,
right,
to go out and finance something that is extraordinarily profitable. If you just look at Russia, which, they try to shut down Russia with sanctions. Well, guess what? Industrial production for the first 4 months of this year is up 3.9%. Unemployment is 4%. That's the lowest figure ever.
And that's what has me scared, Chris. That's what has me scared. So I was actually thinking this morning of trying to dig in and maybe do a video on this, but we've been living this Fed put for 50 years, right? And there's this bias to thinking that things will always go up if we wait, right? The financial advisor tells you it's not timing the markets, it's time in the market. Over time, it's going to go up, right? But that assumes a couple things. One big one, it assumes that the people running the ship want to make things better. And for the first time in my life, it appears that the people steering the ship actually want to make things worse. They're literally, to your point, shutting down energy. There's no investment. They're literally paying farmers not to plant. They're literally decreasing food and energy on purpose. And so the last 50 years, the Fed put worked because people tried to make them better. And everyone's like, will they pivot? Can the Fed save the system? But that implies a bias that they want to. And it seems like there's a bias. It seems like they don't want to save it anymore. It seems like they actually want to drive it into the ground.
You make an excellent point, because what you have is, in a democratic system, if you piss people off, they're going to vote you out. Okay. So there's an incentive to, at least for a period of time, make them feel good. Yeah. So that they can re-elect you in. That's now out the window. That's obvious, I think, to anybody paying attention here, is that they've given up on that. As an example, they just, in the US where you are, they just decided student loan debt. No, don't worry about it. Now, if you take the portion of society that impacts, it's so small that it's not that's not a politically smart move to make, because you've just incensed a certain portion of the population who are now going, oh, hang on, I never went to college because I couldn't afford it, or I never sent my kids to college because I couldn't afford it.
Or I work 2 jobs to pay off my debt.
I'm 35 years old. I just hired a girl. She's like 34 years old, and she's still got student debt, right? And so there's that cohort of society who look at this and go, no, you're not going to be happy with that. So it's not a politically smart move to be making. And you go, why would you make it? And many other actions that have been taken are exactly what you mentioned before. They're literally trying to destroy demand, and they're trying to destroy the economy. But as we can see, if you just read through the WF's documentation, they don't intend to have democracy. So they don't really actually care any longer about what people think. This is all about them implementing their system. The issue that is cropping up, and it always crops up in situations like this, is that not everybody in the world has decided they're going to go along with this, right? So,
which October 16th, 2021, Putin went to Davos and gave a speech.
People should listen to that.
I've memorized part of his speech. And he said, "You woke nations, you think what you're doing is progress? Progress is blurring the lines between men and women, destroying the family. You call that progress?" He said, "That's not progress. That's the same dogmas that Marx and Engels taught that led to the Bolshevik Revolution." And like, we're done. We're out. We're not doing any of that.
Yeah.
And so to your point, and of course, then he's enemy number one in the world,
Of course he is. I mean, people don't want to, they don't want to take another viewpoint. And they're taught that they shouldn't be listening to Putin and he's a terrible man and so on and so forth, which is, it's ludicrous. Now, I'm not suggesting he's a great man at all. I think they're all thugs and sociopaths to a certain degree. But what's important to try and understand is, what are the underlying ideologies? What is it that they actually want? And has that got some level of rationality to it? Will it transpire into some levels of economic freedom? Yes or no? And that's all it is. That's all we've been playing for years. The idea that the West is all good and you have these no, like you've got the deep state that's been running the US for years. And you keep swapping them out, whether you go red or blue, it doesn't really matter. You kind of get variations of the same theme anyway.
Yeah, purple.
And so you've got to understand and say, well, what is it that drives them? What is going to benefit these people? What is it that they're after? I would strongly suggest people go and listen, to that Davos interview that was given. And then just recently, there's the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and he gave a long speech on that. I could send you the link to it after this. It is easily one of the most intelligent, well thought. If I didn't tell you who was saying that, right? If you just took away the bias of the person behind it, and you laid out that text and gave it to people to read, it's hard to disagree with what is being said. And so you get an insight into what it is that's driving Putin and the Kremlin. But back to what we're talking about, not everybody's prepared to go down this path. And I think the mistake that's been made by the Davos man is that they felt like they had most of what they needed to implement the Great Reset, and they could isolate Russia. As soon as they'd isolated Russia and destroyed it, they could then isolate China and keep going. And if you think about the doctrine that's been used in the Middle East for 40 odd years, I think it was the Mackinder doctrine, which is to say, if you fuel both sides of the conflict such that they can never actually form any real resistance and form any economic or political bloc that can push back against you, that's been the doctrine. So that's why they fuel both sides of the war. That influence, that US influence, has been waning for a long time. I was just in the Middle East a couple of months ago. It is so visible and it's transparent and it's openly spoken about by the people in that region. And they really welcome seeing the US go away. The question is that going to open up, and is it going to, are there going to be hostilities that are created amongst the various tribal groups that have always existed in the Middle East? And I would suggest that a lot of those have been accelerated by the US on purpose. And now we've got a new geopolitical players, and you've got China and you've got Russia.
I would even argue that there's two factions inside the United States as well, right? So you kind of have the Obama-Biden administration that's going along with the Davos man EU ECB group. But then I think there's it looks like the Fed is maybe trying to get out of that and working on behalf of the dollar. And then you probably still have quite a few people in the intelligence or military community that want America to be sovereign and strong as well. And I think we've been kind of seeing that play out where if you look at like the Euro Davos ECB crowd has this green agenda, they wanted in Glasgow last year, they wanted to spend 150 trillion over the next 30 years, right? 6 trillion a year on this green energy transition. And Powell told Christine Lagarde last year in June, he's like, hey, we're not doing that. Like our mandates are clear, two mandates, not changing the world to green energy. That was June 21st, I want to say, last year. And that was the day after that speech, he started raising the repo rates. And since then has been draining liquidity out of the ECB or out of the Euro, out of Europe. And Europe has been trying to keep rates negative or low while the Fed keeps taking the screws to them. And it looks like, I know you're not a believer in Bitcoin. We can talk about that another time. But many people talk about Bitcoin like, well, the central bankers would never give up control over money to Bitcoin, which I agree is true, not willingly. But if that's true, then why would Jamie Dimon and the New York Fed give up control to the ECB?
It's not going to happen. No, so, it's more the other way around.
Right. So the
ECB,
but if you put the ECB with the Euro Davos man group and spending 150 trillion for green energy, and I believe the Obama Biden administration going along with that, but then you have the Fed over here going, wait a minute, no, we're protecting the dollar. And so that's what I'm talking about, like the split in these factions. Today it was announced the Fed's doing a stress test on the banks in the US, which they do every year, so it's nothing new. But assuming the stress test comes out good, which I think it will, I think they'll continue to crank the screws up on Europe and continue to drain liquidity out of there.
100%. I am in full agreement. And
so the WEF ECB Euro group is facing battles from both, Putin, Xi Jinping, and maybe even from the Fed.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about this, Mark, is in order to coordinate something from a top level that is not going to benefit all the participants, how do you manage to do that? I think you have to isolate and you silo information flows. If you think about, remember the blood company Theranos?
Right.
Elizabeth Holmes and that?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had this company and they had over 100 employees in all the different departments. You had your marketing department, your R&D department, all these different departments. And you sit there and you're like, how on earth is it possible that you had this massive, obvious fraud taking place? And no one really knew about it for years. And the answer to that question was that each of those little departments were completely siloed in information. Right. They weren't allowed to talk to each other. They could only go to Elizabeth and the other dude, I can't remember the Indian guy who was her partner. So they were the holders of the keys. They were the holders of that information. And so there was no crossover talk. So no one could, the information flows were siloed. And I think we've got a huge amount of that taking place in the deep state. And with respect to, so you've got the Fed and they've got certain incentives. I mean, look, they're owned by the banks, right? And so the banks, they make money in a certain fashion, in a certain way, and they got their own incentives. And then you've got, guys like Zuckerberg, and you've got Gates, and you've got Klaus Schwab, and these guys who've got a certain vision of the world and how they want to see it transpire. You've got multiple people that aren't all going to agree on one thing. So they have to try and silo information, but it's difficult when they're pushing forward like they are now. It's very, very transparent what they're doing, right? You can't go into war and not be transparent that you're going into war. And so now you're seeing this fracturing where you've got these differing interests where at some level they were prepared to participate, right? Because there was a profit motive in it, or there was some coercive tactic or whatever the case might be. But as things transpire, they go hold up a second. So think about commercial banks and central bank digital currencies. Would you want to own a commercial bank if you saw that everything gets centralized with the Fed or the ECB? You'd be like, whoa, hold up a second.
Right.
I go bankrupt overnight.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not going to want that. So, man, each of these topics we could have just dug into and done an hour or two just on each one of those. It's been an amazing conversation, but we've gone super long. you write a newsletter, Capitalist Exploits, which is, and on Twitter, giving out great information, and you run a fund, I believe, Glenroe Capital. Where are you looking to protect and grow money now and over the next year or two? Are you following like this big sector rotation, food and energy, commodities?
Look, I mean, we're pretty simple. We buy what's cheap and try and sell or stay away from that which is expensive. So for the last 3 years, roughly, we've been loading up on energy in particular. And when I say energy, it's, there's your fossil fuel energy, which is nuclear, coal, oil, natural gas. And then you've got the green energy. And that's almost just as interesting to some extent, in that if they're going to push that, and they are, the underlying commodities that are required to bring that to fruition,
like the mineral,
came out of the bear markets. We can argue when it came out of the bear markets, kind of 2 years, maybe 2 years ago. We were a little bit early on it, which saw us take a couple of drawdowns initially, but so be it. So to answer your question, we've been pretty long energy, as well as value oriented. So we believed and continue to believe that we're going to see a rotation from growth to value, which is now, we've seen the rotation out of growth. It's gone into cash largely, which is why the dollar's been strong. But we think it's also going to go into value stocks, which have done well. They've held up pretty well. So, we've got 2 portfolios we run, one which is like a dividend income portfolio. And basically, we just buy boring shit in there. It's value stocks, strong balance sheets. They need to be paying dividends that exceed 8%. It's PEs under like 14. It's just, but for the most part, they're boring bloody companies. They make, I don't know, like a tobacco company in Israel that just that moves tobacco, sells. It doesn't even make the tobacco. It just it's a distribution company. Anyway, they've been going for years and years, and they keep paying out strong dividends. But no one's interested in stuff like that. So those kind of stocks have held up really well. I think over time they're going to get a bid because they can easily double and not be that expensive. So that's been one of our focuses. It's always been a focus, at least in terms of providing almost like a synthetic bond, if you will. And then in terms of the other portfolio we run, we'll take risk in that. We'll take individual equity risk. So across sectors, we try and manage the risk to the extent where we'll have, half of our sector risk is in either ETFs or in large cap companies in, say, like uranium. And then we'll take some smaller positions in riskier stuff, which can, run 10 times for us. But yeah, it's basically, to keep it real simple, if you took a portfolio and you chopped it into 4, and you had 25% in energy, 25% in base metals, commodities, 25% in agriculture, and then 25% in precious metals. Like, you don't have to get too fancy. Don't overthink this stuff. Over the next decade, I think that will outperform handedly the broad indices, any indices. I don't care if it's the Dow. I don't care if it's the DAX. I don't care if it's the SPUs. That I think is going to outperform. So that's, as a kind of nutshell, how we're sort of positioned and focused.
Do you feel that it's probably more uncertain now than maybe it hasn't been any time in your career?
It's definitely more uncertain, but then at the same time, it feels much easier than at any other time. And what I say from that is, when you look at the policies being put in place, when you look at the monetary creation, when you look at all these things that we've been discussing, if you were to just look at the field of investments that one can make, and you eliminate the stuff that looks scary, you go, I can't touch that. So it's bonds, it's growth equities, it's tech stocks, and you just say, okay, that looks too scary. Valuations are scary. No, okay. You get to this point where you look at what's left at the bottom of the barrel, and there's not a whole lot that's left down there because we've had this everything bubble largely, right? Real estate, it's like, yeah, not really, because it's a synthetic to the bond market. That's all it is, at least in the Western developed world. Now, real estate that doesn't have any debt attached to it, fine. But that doesn't exist, at least in your neck of the woods. So some countries, yes, but other countries, no. So it's like you're not left with a whole lot that actually, you could easily say, okay, I could buy that and sit on it for 10 years and just come back later and I think I'll be okay. And that really comes back to the stuff that is deep value. We've had our last commodity bull market ended in roughly 2012. We've had a bear market ever since. And this bear market now is accelerated and exacerbated by liquidity, which is their solution to solve shortage problems. Like they'll probably come out with price caps, rationing of food, which is going to decrease supply more. And then they're going to give you stimuli checks or UBI. All of those things, in the short term, you could have all sorts of moves in the particular markets. In the long term, we know exactly what that does. All you needed to just look at every other country that's ever tried this. Former USSR, Venezuela.
It never ends
You're
good.
going to have shortages and you're going to have massive price rises in those underlying commodities. And I would suggest it's basically Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good stuff. I would agree. It's pretty good detailed breakdown. So hopefully everybody took note of that. Like I said, so much we could talk about. We've gone more like an hour and a half. It goes by so fast. At some point, hopefully you'll get over to the US and we can sit down over a couple of drinks and talk about it for a while. I'm going to be at George Gammon's conference this weekend speaking there. So I know you're a good friend of his. So maybe he'll twist your arm to get you over here to the US at some point here.
Yeah. No, I was seriously considering trying to make this last one now. I'll let you know, but definitely it will be great. And I do plan to make it one of these days.
Yeah. So I'm going to make sure to link your Capital's exploits below your Twitter and your newsletter page. Anything else that you want to shout out or to bring attention to?
Nothing I can think of right now. The only comment, you made some quick comment about Bitcoin. You were pretty bullish on Bitcoin. We held it for years and years and years. I think any asset class that has gone through over 50% drawdowns and survived is worth considering. Mm-hmm. But the issue that, like, very quickly with Bitcoin, we got interested from the utility value. I'm not sure I buy the store of value component necessarily, though I fully understand the limitation in supply, which is a great thing. Basically, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend like I do know. So it's almost like no opinion in that respect on the store of value. But the issue that what we were looking for was for institutions to get into the market. Mm-hmm. When I think about a market cycle, because I used to run a VC firm, and what you would see is you have some new technology, whatever it is that comes out. The first participants in that are your mates. And then after that, it becomes venture capital. And then after venture capital, it goes through into the sort of institutional world and the brokers will start selling it. Then your investment bankers come in and they go, oh, we can package up this shit. And then we can sell it as a package, an ETF or a mutual fund or a whatever it is. And by the time they get there, they're salesmen. So they're just going to sell it to retail. And then once retail come in, there's no one left. So that's your end of your cycle, right? And so with Bitcoin, we wanted to see institutions come in, which then started happening. And of course, when Wall Street gets involved, they always fuck it up. It's what they do. I mean, they just financialize everything.
Yeah.
So it's kind of was a bittersweet situation where, on the one hand, we were waiting for them to come. We knew that they were going to fuck it up, which they've done. They created, and when I say Wall Street, like there's all these firms out there.
Sure.
But basically, they're all ex-Wall Street people went and started running them. Solana and Tether and all of this Luna. I mean, basically, you've got a lot of
over leveraging the system.
Guys, they know the system. So now they're just taking a different asset class and they're going, hey, this is cool. Let's go and recreate it. We know how to do this.
Yeah.
So they just concoct the same sort of sausage. So that's what concerned us when we saw all of that sort of nonsense taking place. We know that they're going to package it up. They're going to create all these new things, and then they're going to flog it to retail, and you have this insanity take place. Now, that doesn't mean that crypto goes away or that Bitcoin goes away. It just means that there's a washout, and so we're getting a washout, and it's healthy, it's good.
Yeah.
The bad players and the shills and the hucksters and everybody else should be revealed for who they are, and hopefully people will learn. Unfortunately, that many won't, but that's just the nature of things. So,
yeah.
But there's a huge difference also between all of the garbage, like the .coms.
Sure.
You get pets.com. Pets.com was not the same as Cisco. Cisco was a business. It was an actual business. It just got stupidly expensive.
Yeah.
Right. But it was still a proper business. Pets.com was not.
Right.
So in the same light, but when pets.com is going through the roof, you still don't want to own Cisco, because Cisco is part of that whole thing. So, we got very lucky in terms of timing. We started leaguing out at like 45, then another chunk at 55, and then our final sell was 60, and we got out, and we just, part of it was also we looked and said, well, we can go and buy coal stocks at 1 to 2 times PE with 15% divvies.
Yeah.
There's no debt. I'm like, that's retarded. Why would you not? These things can go up 5 times and be cheap.
Yeah, it's a good take. I mean, basically that was Cuppy's kind of argument about it as well, and he kind of rotated out as well. So, I get it from that perspective, and I think you actually laid it out pretty clearly. So I appreciate that. One, I think to your point with the pets.com, I think I'm working on my presentation for George's event, and if you look at technology cycles, they all kind of repeat the same process. And I found the story from the mid 1800s on bicycles. And when bicycles came out, they're so dangerous. And why do people need to be gliding so fast down the sidewalks? And then there was 350 bicycle manufacturers, and then they all went out of business. But that didn't end the bike. The bike's around. And then the automobiles, there was 250 automobile manufacturers, and they all went out of business, and 3 remained. And then to your point, the pets.com, the webvan.com, all of that. Also, there was in the heydays of the internet, these publicly traded companies couldn't trust their data on the big open internet. They had to build private intranets. Right. And then billions of dollars are spent on intranets, and like all that's gone, right? There's just one protocol. So I think you see this happen over and over. And so to your point, it cycles, and then you get this explosion of VC money, and then it collapses, and a couple remain and move on, like it's always happened. And to your point, you didn't want to own Cisco when pets.com was there. And that's actually a great point. And so there's kind of this proverbial, I guess, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Where we're very quick to point out it's Bitcoin, not cryptocurrency. Crypto's over here, and then you got Bitcoin over here. But to your point, I guess Bitcoin gets thrown out with the bathwater when
which is great. I mean, look, I'm a simple guy. I just like buying stuff that represents dirt cheap. When everybody absolutely hates it, and we'll get there. I mean, so when everyone's just hates Bitcoin, when they hate it and they've lost their shirt, then it's interesting to me. And of course, then you can go and you can look at retracement levels, and you can look at a whole bunch of other stuff. So, I'm not discounting any of that, but broadly, just from a psychological perspective, you need to have that broad washout where everybody just hates something. And you don't always get it. Sometimes you can just have sort of more gentle cyclical moves. But when you get those super destructive washouts, that's fantastic. That's the best thing you can look for.
Sure, because simply markets stop going up when there's no more buyers and they stop going down when there's no more sellers. So you get that washout and there's no one left to sell. And then that's a good point for a bottom. Yeah, I think, but back to the kind of presentation I put together too. I mean, if you zoom back to like you said, when it survived several 50% drawdowns, like the Tulip Mania had one drawdown and never came back, but Amazon had 380% drawdowns. Right. And so Bitcoin, I think, is on its I think it's at 385% drawdowns. This one's about 70% right now. So anyway, well, I'm glad we clarified that. I think we'll put a pin at that point. And with that, we're probably going to go ahead and sign it off. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. So much to cover. I'm going to probably have to go back and re-listen to all this again. And then we'll have to do it again at some point soon.
Good. No, good chatting, mate. It's I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Chris. Hopefully you enjoyed that interview with Chris Macintosh from Capitalist Exploits. I'm going to make sure that we link to all his stuff in the description, so make sure to check that out. And hopefully that was helpful. It was very helpful for me to think about where to put money in this day and age when, like I said, the world seems more uncertain than ever. But leave me a comment and let me know what you think. If you need to, you could rewind it and listen to it again, and maybe I will as well. But leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Of course, hit that subscribe button if you're not already. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and if you don't, give me a thumbs down. That's okay. But at least leave me a comment, all right? And that's what I got for you today. To your success. I'm out. Since you've stayed to the end, I know you like this video, which means you're probably going to really like this video right here and this video right here.